Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to this Think Small Cell webinar, where I'm joined by Caroline Gabriel, Head of Research at Rethink Technology Research, and Kyung Mung, the Senior Analyst who's focusing on small cells at analyst firm Mobile Experts. Now, before I hand over to our two presenters, let me just introduce the structure of the event. I'll be giving a very brief introduction and explaining a few terms and some of the new technologies that we'll be covering later, and then hand the baton over to Caroline and Kyung in turn for them to give their 5-year small cell forecasts, not just the numbers, but the reasoning, the thinking and the factors involved. And then we'll have a quick audience poll to check what you think in that regard, followed by a Q&A session. And at any time during the webinar, feel free to submit a question on the panel on your screen. So without further ado, let me proceed just to share a few observations about the evolution or the progress that mobile networks have made in the last couple of years. And I'd like to point you to this report from OpenSignal, which is a business that measures the actual data rates available throughout the world in many networks, averages them all up, and compares the different speeds on different technologies. And if we look at what the situation they reported in 2014, what we saw was that 3G and 3.5G were achieving about 4 megabits. LTE was already ahead at 6.5 megabits. But if you wanted the fastest speeds, you were typically getting them over Wi-Fi, and indeed most of the traffic to your smartphone was and is passed over Wi-Fi at home and in the office and elsewhere. But you contrast that with the situation reported just last month, and you can see that 3G is actually slowed down. Much of the traffic is now carried on LTE, which despite that heavy load has increased speeds by a factor of almost 3. So these are the average speeds worldwide measured by smartphone devices, and that's very impressive. Whereas the growth in speed for Wi-Fi is only about 10 or 20%. And that may well be because Wi-Fi itself is getting ever more heavily loaded. We have many more devices, something like 10 or 15 devices typically on a home Wi-Fi access point, and these are just getting congested. And they may also be constrained by the backhaul links and the broadband links that they're connected to. But nonetheless, it shows that the cellular industry is certainly keeping up with the performance and the speeds that people are looking for. But that will never be enough. There's always demand for faster data rates and higher speeds, more video. And there are a number of technologies coming down the pipe over the next 2 or 3 years which should help solve that problem. The simplest one is perhaps just to combine Wi-Fi with LTE and operate data streams in parallel and aggregate both of them. And there are a couple of different technologies, LWA and LWIP, which achieve that in slightly different ways. And they can be deployed relatively quickly. They do need compatible handsets and some core network equipment, but there's not so much involved in the physical RF side of the networks. Another technology that will be coming out relatively quickly is CBRS, Citizens Broadband Radio Service, which provides 150 megahertz of dynamically allocated spectrum available throughout the US, and that will become available from next year. It uses very much standard LTE in the handset and the small cell. The clever bit is connecting the small cells to a dynamic spectrum allocation server, a central database that's smart enough to assess which spectrum is available and what power levels can be used in different places. And this could be used to enable either a full standalone cellular service using LTE or through roaming with existing network operators. Another technology that's coming through is to use the unlicensed band, the Wi-Fi band at 5 gigahertz. And what we can do is augment or boost the speed that you get through your normal LTE licensed connection with additional bandwidth at 5 gigahertz. Now, because this is sharing the same spectrum as Wi-Fi, it does need some changes to the physical layer chips. We need to introduce a feature called Listen Before Talk, so that rather than just transmitting, you have to check and see if any other device in the vicinity is broadcasting on that frequency band, and very quickly make a decision in a few microseconds whether you can use it or not. And that feature would need to be incorporated both into the handsets and into the small cells. Now, if that's available, it could potentially achieve data rates of several hundred megabits when you require it, but it would still be controlled and monitored by the main LTE service that you have from your operator. Now, that standard was published in the middle of this year. There is a complementary standard that provides a similar feature on the uplink in release 14 that will come out next year. So when there's a lot of traffic, for example, to upload your photos and synchronize that with iCloud, etc., that can satisfy that data rate. And finally, there is a feature or a solution called Multifier, which combines both the downlink and uplink of LAA to operate a full LTE service in the unlicensed band at 5 gigahertz. Now, again, this, because it's operating in unlicensed spectrum, it could be completely independent of a cellular network. It could be a standalone private solution for a big factory or industrial complex or a shopping center, but equally it could be connected through to interoperate with other existing cellular networks just as another roaming partner, or even as a RAN, another radio network for them to connect with. We've explained Multifier in more depth in a white paper that's available on the ThinkSmallCell website. So you'll see these terms appear in the forecasts from our analysts in a moment. So without further ado, I'd like to hand the baton over to Caroline to present her forecasts for small cells and 5G. Caroline, over to you.
Thanks very much, David. Yes, as David just said, I'm Caroline Gabriel. I'm a co-founder and head of research at Rethink Technology Research, which is a specialised research and consulting firm based here in London. And we are particularly focused on forecasting the deployment plans of mobile operators and increasingly other types of providers who may be deploying wireless equipment, including in unlicensed spectrum. And a lot of our work over the past several years has been specifically looking at small cell deployment plans. And so I'm going to share some of the results of our latest set of forecasts with you today. These are based on a survey run over the last 2 months, and there were about 76 respondents, Tier 1 and 2 mobile operators. We do that survey biannually. And as I say, in the more recent ones, we have included other providers, including web-scale service providers, Wi-Fi providers, and cable companies. I'll show 3 slides. This one is showing our most recent forecast for small cell deployments. This is looking at the millions of new units, so that includes brand new sites and also upgrades being deployed per year. So it's not installed base, this is actually shipments out to install. So say our methodology is an operator-driven one based on in-depth surveys of a broad base of service providers around the world. And that results for us in an indication of what those operators believe that they will deploy in the coming 5 years. And of course, that's a rolling 5 years. We started this in 2009. Perhaps the most interesting thing, as you can probably imagine, is seeing how the patterns change as you look back over the forecasts from previous years. Operators can be they can be over-optimistic. Some are over-pessimistic, but over-optimistic is much more common. And as I'm sure most people in the small cell industry know, a lot of what operators believed they would do a few years ago, they have not been able to do. And I know we'll look at some of the barriers that have prevented them as this webinar goes along. So it's important to say that this is a forecast based on probably what the operators currently think, with some caveats added by ourselves as analysts, as experts in this field. But we do also do best case and worst case scenarios. This is very much a mid case and has come is relatively conservative, I believe. Some interesting patterns here. The residential market it continues to be deployed. It's fairly flat in terms of growth, and it will peak in 2019. We're much more focused in detail on the other markets. So enterprise, which we split into two, private enterprise where the networks are for employees or some controlled group, and public enterprise, something like a retail mall, for instance, where an enterprise deploys the network but it is open to the public to use. You can see both these sectors, which have been on a very slow boil, but we saw quite a lot of growth in deployments during the past 12 months. That growth remains modest in 2017, but really achieves quite a lot of momentum in 2018, 2019, as you can see from the graph. And particularly in the public field, where we see a lot of the barriers that are preventing deployments in places like transport hubs and retail outlets and so on will gradually be addressed, as I think we'll look at later on. The biggest growth in compound annual growth rate terms is in the urban sector, so outdoor publicly available small cells. That is from a very small base. So 79% is perhaps not so impressive, given that up until 2018, you can see the purple section is really pretty minimal. So this market really gets some volumes in 2019 onwards, based on densification programs and operators starting to prepare for 5G. We don't include 5G forecasts at this point because we don't quite know what that's going to be. However, we do believe that a lot of operators will be putting architectures in place that will be 5G ready, and those are to some extent included here. But you can see that the overall small cell deployments peak in 2020. That is because from 2021 onwards we will see specific 5G deployments. We think 5G will involve extremely small cells, but we're not including those numbers yet into our forecast. It's a little early for that. But the overall interest is to see how the patterns have changed over the years. The tipping points have certainly come later than expected when we compare to previous forecasts, even last year's. We think the enterprise reached it this year, and urban still has a little way to go. This is really picking up on some of the points that David just made. The impact of new spectrum on this whole landscape, and I won't repeat what David just told us because that was really informative. But I think the important message is that there are several key barriers that have prevented small cells from fulfilling their forecast potential in recent times, and some of those are deployment issues like site and backhaul acquisition and the need for some kind of neutral host platform. But another one has been spectrum. In some cases, the older spectrum for small cells, of course, is controlled by the mobile operators, and yet there are many other stakeholders who can see that they would like to deploy small cells, or at least be able to manage them, and don't have these opportunities. So we do think that some of the shared and unlicensed spectrum options will be extremely important to stimulate small cell deployment and allow other participants to sort of get into the value chain. And the other interesting spectrum development, which is very small cell specific, is the move up to try to exploit the higher frequency bands, including millimeter and centimeter wave bands. With the exception of WiGig, which already is commercialized in 6 60 gigahertz. These are fairly unknown quantities, but of course there's a lot of capacity up there and very much untapped for mobile broadband. So seeing a lot of growth or a lot of interest at this point, which we think will translate into growth in high-frequency spectrum and also in any spectrum that is unlicensed or shared or dynamic. I think we're particularly interested in the 3.5 band. The CBRS band is in the US, which is a very innovative approach to sharing spectrum, but also around the rest of the world it's largely available. It's been used for fixed wireless, but regulators are gradually starting to permit mobility, and it's a very classic small cell band permitting very dense deployments of sort of zones of capacity, indoor, outdoor, using small cells. So we, as you can see from the graph, in 2017, as you might expect, new deployments are still 70% going into the licensed sub-6 gigahertz, very traditional bands. But there is interest and there are trials, and these figures do include trials, by the way. Obviously, most of these above 20 gigahertz activity is taking place in trials, but they're very large-scale trials by the end of next year in the US, in China, and other parts of the world. And then by the time we get to 2021, the spectrum mix is a lot more varied, with new deployments into sub-6 becoming less than 40% and split between all kinds of other spectrum options. And in many cases, that is enabling non-traditional operators to take part in the value chain, as everyone that delivers services recognises by this point that they need to deliver a lot of density and capacity. We couldn't avoid mentioning 5G. I don't think, as I say, we're not forecasting 5G in terms of specific unit deployments yet. We believe it's too early for that. But of course, one of the few things perhaps that most people agree about 5G is that it will support a high level of density, and that it will be very focused on small cells, in some cases extremely small cells, and possibly arranged in very new architectures compared to what we have now. So I thought it was worth including something of what the operators are saying about how they will move towards 5G from a small cell perspective. And I guess the overall point to make is that LTE is going to survive for a very long time. And even operators like NTT Docomo and Deutsche Telekom, who are recognised as groundbreakers in pushing 5G, are saying very publicly that they expect to keep enhancing LTE for at least a decade after they deploy 5G, and they are, really pushing their suppliers to listen to that message. Operators will have extremely variable timescales for 5G, just as they have for previous generations. You have to remember that a lot of people haven't moved much beyond 3G yet. And initially, the initial use cases are very specific. There's a fixed wireless one in the US. There's sort of large events and venues driving 5G, as we see in the Olympics and so on. But those are very specific examples. In terms of it becoming really mainstream for general mobile broadband or Internet of Things services, that's going to be a much slower process. So you can see that before 2020, only 8% of MNOs expect to deploy any kind of 5G radio. But by contrast, you can see that nearly 80% of them will have embarked on a dense HETNet program, bringing density and capacity with small cells. And almost 70% believe that they will be starting at least to deploy virtualization, cloud RAN, virtualization into the RAN, and mobile edge computing. These two technologies are very much enablers of 5G, but can be deployed in the LTE stage and will be. So the overall message of this slide is operators are preparing for 5G. Small cells are a very important part of that preparation. They are putting them into new architectures which will be certainly more 5G friendly, and particularly the virtualized small cell network. But the actual 5G radio swap for most operators is going to come much later. In fact, for 45% of them, it will be 2024 and afterwards, according to their current planning and their current thinking. That may change, but that's what they're saying at the moment. So the important point to make is that many of the architectures that we believe will be part of 5G are starting in 4G and in the small cell layer. That will help to drive small cell innovation and small cell deployment, but it will also reshape, I think, the way that small cells behave and the way that they're deployed. So that's really the key points from me, at which point I'll hand back to David.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Well, that was certainly a very promising outlook for all sorts of small cells for the next 5 or 10 years. It's now time for me to hand the baton over to our other expert analyst, Kyung Mung, who works for Mobile Experts in the US.
Great, thank you, David. Hello, everyone. My name is Kyung Moon. I'm a senior analyst at Mobile Experts. We are a market research and market analyst firm based in the United States. We have a group of 4 analysts located throughout in the United States as well as Canada. I specialize specifically in the small cells. As many of you may already know, our partner, Joel Madden, who has been tracking this industry for quite some time, have the honor of looking at this particular industry. So from our perspective, as you can see in this chart, the small cell shipment forecast, we expect a fairly steady growth. That in terms of breaking down of the small cell shipments across these 4 different categories. Residential, I think, as Caroline has mentioned, that we expect this to be a fairly flat, but we expect this to continue to grow, have a steady growth going forward as operators look to deploy residential femto cells as a kind of a coverage enhancement solution for their subscribers. And we expect to continue for foreseeable future, although at a very minor growth rate. The next in line, as we look at the enterprise class, we have this chart really comes from our small cell report that we publish annually and update on a quarterly basis. This enterprise class really, constitutes of what we call kind of a carrier indoor small cells as a enterprise class, meaning the enterprise can directly purchase and deploy. We expect this market to grow at a, obviously much healthier growth rate than residential. And we believe that's going to stem from the fact that, we continue to have indoor coverage issues. There are existing solutions out there ranging from Wi-Fi to distributed antenna systems, but we believe that there will be more enterprise class small cells that really addresses a particular needs of smaller enterprise venues. So we expect a fairly steady and a healthy growth rate for that class of the small cells. And then next one, we have a remote radio head. And we believe these are the devices that can really be leveraged by the mobile operators to really densify their both indoor and outdoor deployments. And especially as we look out into 5G time period, looking out to 2019 and 2020, we expect this to be more widely deployed in the context of Cloud RAN that Caroline mentioned earlier. And lastly, we have what we call carrier class. These are predominantly outdoor units, including both, I would say, more classical 5-watt type of radios, plus much higher power devices deployed for kind of what we call, dense coverage hold solutions, as well as rural deployments. And we expect a fairly good, healthy growth rate for these devices because I think there will continue to be a need for densification and capacity enhancement solutions for mobile operators as they look to continue to refarm their spectrum. As they refarm spectrum, sometimes you're going to have a different types of grid, and that will require a coverage holes to be filled. So I think these type of solutions will be more widely deployed by mobile operators. So we expect a fairly steady growth. I mean, when you look at the overall average growth trend from 2015 to 2021, we're looking at about low double-digit type of growth, but when excluding the residential, you're looking at a growth rate about between 30 to 40%. One thing I would note here on this particular chart is kind of a little bit of a nuanced view is that we expect, the newer LAA unlicensed spectrum technologies, such as 3.5 and especially LAA and LTU, to come into play in 2017 time period. So we expect a little bit of a bump up in terms of the small cell shipments related to those technologies. As we look out at 2019 and specifically 2020 time period, as we look at more kind of latency, low latency type of application, we expect mobile operators and others to really densify their networks more greatly, and we expect small cell shipments to really ride that tailwind and then increase the shipment forecast there as well. So as we talked about the unlicensed LTE, this is the one view that we have. This is a chart that denotes the carrier access point shipments across a pretty broad category. One is what we call pure Wi-Fi. As we know, carriers have been deploying Wi-Fi solutions in the early days, many years ago when they were looking to Wi-Fi as an offload solution. So many of the carriers that through partnerships or directly themselves have deployed Wi-Fi access points to really meet the needs of the data tsunami that was coming their way with the smartphone adoptions. And we expect that pure Wi-Fi type of solution will continue to ship, but it may gradually declining manner as mobile operators specifically look to unlicensed technologies such as LTE Wi-Fi aggregation, or LWIP, and more specifically LTU LAA type of solutions. And we believe they will use that because that would give them more of a control of the quality of service, at the same time being able to increase their capacity. As we look out into 2019 and on outgoing years, we expect more of what we call pure LTE unlicensed technology, such as multi-fire or 3.5 in the United States specifically, to really come into play, and mobile operators as well as some other new entrants or other types of non-traditional mobile operators to be adopt this technology to grow their wireless capacity needs. Obviously, this is something that we all know, which is that operators will look to unlicensed spectrum because really, at the end of the day, it provides a lower cost per bit economics. It's all about transporting bits from one point to another, and spectrum obviously is a big part of that cost element. And so this particular chart really illustrates what we call mobile operators' typical macro cell site economics. So this is a per cell site economics, and translating that into monthly cost per gigabyte, delivering a gigabyte of data on a monthly basis. So if you were to break down the cost elements across the different major cost categories, such as power, backhaul, site lease, tower lease for the macro case, and the network equipment being the radio and some of the ancillary networking, site networking equipment. And lastly, the spectrum that's noted in light blue there. Obviously in a macro case, the licensed spectrum has traditionally been very expensive for many of the mobile operators across the globe. Specifically in the United States, it's been costing them billions of dollars to acquire licensed spectrum. So when you factor all those costs in and translating that into cost per gigabyte on a monthly basis, as you can see on a macro case, it's much higher, but traditional licensed small cells has provided a lower cost per bit economics because you're obviously densifying and you're serving a smaller number of subscribers, so you can effectively share larger amounts of capacity across your subscriber base. So when you look at that, the licensed small cell has provided a lower cost-effective solution when you're talking about a capacity augmentation strategy is concerned. As we look into the unlicensed spectrum in terms of license access LAA technology, it lowers that economics even further because you're really, in essence, removing that spectrum cost, as well as some of the, case of some of the operators, even removing some of the site costs as well.
Yes, just while I move on to the next slide, Kyung, I've got one question of clarification. Is this unlicensed spectrum related purely to enterprise indoor deployments, or do you see it being also urban sector as well, outdoor?
We believe it can be applied for outdoor case as well. Obviously, with the specifically in terms of the LAA, which is using a 5.8 gigahertz band, there's a regulatory power limit to how strongly you could radiate that signal. So you're going to have perhaps a smaller coverage, but that might be just enough for a particular operator. But we believe it can be used both for outdoor and indoor, but we expect, in this case, could be used for indoors as well.
Okay, thanks.
By the way, the chart that I was showing earlier was really showcasing the outdoor deployment scenario.
Ah, yes, because there probably wouldn't be any site rental charges for many indoor deployments, or it's a different commercial arrangement. Okay,
Correct.
Thanks.
Sure. So in this particular chart is a slightly different view than the previous view. This is a more in terms of looking at unlicensed access points. This is unlicensed LTE access points. And as you can see here, our expectation is that the traditional Wi-Fi solution will be used by carriers, but we expect the Wi-Fi deployment or usage will decline over time as they look to take advantage of some of the other technologies that's really based more on LTE-based technologies that can leverage the unlicensed spectrum. It's not quite clearly in this chart, but the 3.5, we expect some small volume, but expect some volume to occur in 2018. More specifically, we expect to see some trials happening next year, very nominal shipment volumes, but little bit more meaningful volume in 2018 and really ramp up in 2019. And we expect multi-fire to ramp up starting in 2019 as well.
So again, just for clarification, at the start of my presentation, I talked about LWA and LWIP, where you can combine LTE and carrier Wi-Fi. So this carrier Wi-Fi segment that you're talking about, would that be a single product that's got LTE and carrier Wi-Fi and uses one of those technologies, or are you talking about operating with standalone Wi-Fi access points?
Yeah, this particular chart is showing the standalone carrier Wi-Fi access points. This chart does not show the, for example, the LAA or LWAP is the couple of charts before where I show the what we call hybrid devices.
Okay, thank you. That's just helpful. Any other comments, or is that are you done?
Yeah, so I guess a couple comments I would like to make is that we have a separate report specifically looking at different categories of I would say small cell type of devices. We have the very first chart that we showed was from the small cell report, and we have a couple of other reports specifically looking at carrier Wi-Fi segment as well as looking at the for example the unit economics. We have a separate expert insights report really more centered around looking at strategic issues and cost models that really drives our forecast.
Okay. Right. Well, unless there's anything else, what I'd like to do is ask the audience what they think of what they've just heard from our two industry experts. And on a very simple way, whether you think the forecasts that you've just seen presented are either far too optimistic and unreasonable, or they're about right, or whether in fact you're more bullish and you think they're too pessimistic, and we'll ship more of those. And I'll just share the results. You should see those on your screen now. And I think our analysts will be quite pleased to see that 45% of them thought they were about right. Meanwhile, 40% didn't really know it. I mean, it's very hard to make these assessments. I think our analysts have both put their reputations on the line because it is such a complex issue. Any quick reaction? And Caroline, do you have any? Does that surprise you, what people are saying?
Well, it's always nice to hear that of the people who had an opinion. Obviously, a lot of them think we're doing about right, which probably reflects that people appreciate how difficult this is, that it's not a matter of hitting a precise number, but of showing patterns and trends. But it's gratifying to see that only 15% actually think that we got it wrong, which is fairly low.
It is. Kayan, are you happy that people are quite confident with what you're saying?
Yeah, likewise to Caroline. I'm happy to hear that we're about right, but I would love to speak to those who thought we were too pessimistic. So.
Well, they've got sales forecasts to meet or whatever. Yes. Okay. No, that's very, very positive. So now we go on to our Q&A session, where any of our listeners can ask questions directly of our analysts. Again, one quick point of clarification that came in earlier. Just to make it clear, these figures that you're seeing are for the global market. They're not specific to any region, North America or Europe. It's very much a worldwide picture. So, first question that come in a couple of different angles is around neutral hosts. I think that generally people are asking, how will these organizations start to appear? When can we see them? What sort of number of them will be? Will there be hundreds or just half a dozen per country? What sort of size and shape can we expect them to take? Caroline, do you have a view on how these might emerge?
Yes, I think, well, for a start, I think it's probably, if I had to pick one reason why small cells haven't taken off as quickly as people had hoped, public small cells, it would be that we haven't achieved these neutral host platforms, and it's just not practical to have each operator building out an individual small cell network, partly for logistical reasons and partly for cost reasons. So I think it's been a real problem for the industry and remains a real problem. But in some areas, I think we are starting to see various approaches to neutral host. Of course, it partly depends on the market landscape, but also on the regulatory environment. I think ideally, you probably have a point where per country you had perhaps 3 or 4 neutral host platforms, rather similar numbers to how many you have macro networks, but not overlapping with each other nearly so much, and not necessarily the same operators. So I think we're seeing the model where mobile operators share a network, of course, or one mobile operator builds it and the others come on board. But I think what's really interesting, particularly to introduce new participants and new service providers, is seeing a third-party neutral host platform, particularly some of the technologies that are emerging where that's very much managed from the cloud, and capacity and so on can be allocated to different MVNOs on a very dynamic basis. I don't think it's technically a huge breakthrough, because it does happen to some extent in managed Wi-Fi. But I think that's how the market will expand, is by copying Wi-Fi in that respect. And I think people are starting to realise that the technologies are there. It's just the mobile operators are obviously in control of the spectrum, and I think it's difficult for them to give up that control that they traditionally have. But and therefore, in some cases, they just haven't done anything at all and have been resistant to it. But the more urgent it becomes for them to have extra capacity, the more they're going to have to swallow their misapprehensions about it.
Okay, thanks. Kayan, what's your view on how neutral host organizations might evolve?
Yeah, I think in your neutral hosts, I guess when I look at the neutral hosts in the context of small cells, we could look at it in terms of, what is a market that is trying to address. And I think, when you look at the mobile industry, there has always been a kind of neutral host concept, especially when you look at the tower industry is a great example of that. But as we look at the neutral host provider's role in the small cells, really we're looking to an organization that is a little needs to take a more wider scope of responsibility, I would say, compared to macro sense, in the sense that they would have to take on the role of the equipment deployments as well. In some cases, depending on what market you're addressing, might need to also handle the managed services aspect. So I think those markets will really be potentially could be enhanced or accelerated by the rise of the new scheme like 3.5 CBRS, where in that particular context, I think we would need to have a more active neutral host provider who can work alongside with the SAS providers as well as the mobile operators to, in certain contexts, in servicing a particular customer segment, i.e. enterprises and renewals.
Yeah, so that's going to be interesting to see those organizations evolve and appear over the next kind of one or 2 years, I guess. Okay, we've had a few questions. Well, one question in particular that's close to my heart, which is about VoLTE, which seems to be quite a difficult feature to add to LTE, and of course is required. If you're going to provide LTE only service, you need to have voice as well as data, and that's where VoLTE fits in. So how critical is the adoption of VoLTE, the availability of VoLTE in the main carrier networks to your forecasts, and how does it affect the mix of whether it would be 3G LTE multi-mode versus just pure LTE and LTE plus LAA type of products? Perhaps if I could start with you, Kayan.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think the VoLTE, as you mentioned, I mean, when we're talking about small cells, we talked about in the context of indoor coverage and people expect to have both voice service as well as the data service just to be seamless as possible. Obviously, operators have an incentive to move on to a single platform to reduce their costs, and we see some operators that are being more active than the others in terms of driving the VoLTE ecosystem. But in our forecast, we looked at a lot of the small cells adopting the multi-band or multi-mode concept, adding another radio chain to support both 3G and 4G. So I think until we see more as a critical mass of both the device ecosystem or subscriber base who have the capability to take advantage of VoLTE, I think we will see the 3G being in existence for some time, and many of our small cell forecasts includes multi-band or multi-mode type of devices that includes 3G.
Caroline, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I broadly agree with that. Just a couple of additional points. We do see VoLTE as a driver for small cells in our forecast for operators who realise they have got to have much better coverage to support VoLTE than they do to support data. So that it is a driver to start filling in those gaps. But another thing that we see is a recognition that it's not just about filling in the gaps so that the calls can be supported, but that the network has to be much better optimized than it is for data only. And so there's a lot of extra effort that's required, particularly with SON, to make these small cells dense enough and capable of supporting voice. So although I think it is a driver to deploy small cells, it's not one that's actually feeding through much into most operators' sort of near-term plans, because they just see VoLTE as being such a difficult thing to deploy. I think Wi-Fi calling is an interesting one, because going back to the previous points made by all of us about the mixing in unlicensed spectrum, we actually see a lot of interest in supporting Wi-Fi calling as well as VoLTE out of the same IMS, and that's driving the type of cells that get deployed, I think perhaps to a greater extent than the 3G, 4G mix.
Thanks. We've had a couple of questions come in that aren't quite related to the neutral host topic earlier, but they're really looking at it more from the enterprise IT department side of things. So partly it's, do you see CBRS being deployed in many small companies, or will it typically just be the large companies, the large businesses that can afford to make this sort of investment? And potentially, could we have a number of IT enterprise IT businesses collaborating to provide some sort of internal roaming system that I don't know, bypasses the carriers completely in certain circumstances? Hadn't really thought about that one before. Do you have any views on that, Caroline?
Yeah, I'd say yes to that question. I think
sorry.
two
Yes
things.
to the first.
I mean, yes to the second bit of it. That these new systems can emerge that will bypass carriers. I think carriers at the moment find it extremely difficult to make a strong business case for supporting small businesses. However, other types of companies, as we see in managed Wi-Fi, make very good businesses out of supporting Wi-Fi for small businesses, increasingly from the cloud. I think that model works just as well with small cells, and bands like CBRS, but also some of the others we've mentioned, will enable that. So yes, I think it will get into smaller companies, but it will need new organisations to help that happen, and I think we will look at more of a Wi-Fi model going on because of the more open spectrum.
Kayang, anything to add to that view?
Yeah, I think it's certainly possible. I mean, for the 3.5 to be used kind of in a private LTE context. But I think the key question there is how small is a small enterprise? If you're talking about an enterprise that has IT resources who can manage the telecom networks in a similar manner they do with Wi-Fi. So, it comes down to how easy is that deployment and activation of 3.5 radios within the context of enterprise. I mean, is that similar to Wi-Fi so that the activation and provisioning process can be so seamless where they do not need to look to outside help to do that? As we talked about earlier, 3.5 does require a little bit of an extra layer, if you will, in terms of coordinating with the database, central database servers that you mentioned, David. I think that role, or someone who can take on that role and scaling that across multiple number of smaller enterprises, I think is going to be important.
But just to be clear, the spectrum allocation server database provider doesn't have to be the same organization that's the neutral host that's actually carrying the traffic and interconnecting with other mobile network operators.
That's correct. It doesn't have to be, and I expect, if you're talking about smaller enterprises, the concept of a neutral host provider, has tended to be more regional in nature when you look at kind of the other industries. So, we would expect some regional focus neutral host providers could come in and play their role, but again, they would have to make some investment in terms of know-how and being able to interact seamlessly with the central database service.
Okay, and last question before we wrap up. You've provided a global view. I know we've talked about certain US market features like CBRS, but what specific regional variations do you see around the world? Are small cells going to be more predominant in North America or LATAM or in parts of Asia? Have you any kind of obvious milestones or features to look for in each of those countries that we might identify progress being made? If I could pass that one to Caroline first, please.
Yes, many regional variations. I think some interesting ones. We know about North America. Certainly, it's starting to take off, and I think it's very much pushing towards those higher bands as well. Asia is very interesting because there are the places that we know about, Japan and South Korea, small urban countries which are already are massively dense. But I think India is a very interesting one, where we're seeing operators who are actually using small cells for a different purpose, not because they require that level of capacity and density yet, but because they see it as having different economics, being a different way to build out networks, and also starting to support a lot more third-party services. Now they're allowed to do that. So I think that's an interesting case study of how to use small cells, not for capacity specifically, but because it enables you to sort of get into new markets at relatively low entry cost. So I definitely pick India as an important one. going forward. And some of the South American countries, I don't think South America has been a hotbed of small cells up till now, but there's a real interest and pressure again, because I think operators are starting to think, is there economically a different way to deploy the networks compared to what we've done in the past? And so Mexico, I guess in particular, Argentina, those both seem to be countries where the operators are being quite creative.
Kayang, any comments on that?
Yeah, I would share Caroline's view. I guess when you look at the small cell market, we expect, the North American obviously is a strong market for small cells, and also, China and Asia Pacific in general has been will continue to be a strong market for small cells as we look towards 5G. And with the 5G, as we're talking about, in addition to capacity enhancements, as we look at the low latency type of application when that takes off, I think all the operators are moving towards that mode of virtualizing and densifying their networks, and they're paving the way towards 5G and 6G as we look at forward. I mean, that the need for the traffic will not end anytime soon. So we expect that trend to continue, and we expect developed markets such as North America, China, Pacific, and Europe to a certain degree will continue to look at that. And to Caroline's point, I think some of the operators in other regions are looking to small cells as because of their economics or lower economics to deploying wireless networks.
Thanks, Kayang. It's that's us pretty much out of time now. I regret we don't have time for any more questions today, but thanks very much for a number of the audience who submitted questions, and I hope we covered the general themes, if not the specific question that you asked. I think we've heard today that the technology for small cells is available to deploy and working today, particularly growing in the enterprise sector. And the outlook for operators to deploy very dense het nets in advance of 5G is quite promising. The forecasts that our two experts presented today are either generally agreed by the audience to be in the right ballpark, or I think, as many of us would say, it's a very difficult to make these predictions with any assurance of accuracy because there's so many complex factors. But I hope that what you've heard today has allowed you to assess the market for the future. If you haven't visited ThinkSmallCell.com or signed up for our newsletter, I'd encourage you to do so now. All of the presenters are available for follow-up questions if you want information about not just this particular topic of research or adjacent ones. I'm sure they'd be delighted to help you. But last but not least, I'd like to thank our audience for taking the time to listen to the webinar. I hope you found it worthwhile. So thanks very much, and thanks to our presenters. That finishes the webinar for today.